Welcome to In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay, where we get candid about what it takes to negotiate effectively. You'll learn from the challenges and successes of entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. We help you change the nature of your negotiations and get more from every deal you do.
Hey everyone, Christine McKay. Welcome back to In the Ven Zone, where we help small businesses learn how to ask for more of what you want, and then we teach you the tools and techniques to negotiate for it. And we do that here on this show by having guests in the small business world who have been incredibly successful, who have great negotiation stories. And today is no exception. We are joined today by Andre Champagne. Yes, I do love the last name. It is one of my favorite beverages, I have to confess. So Andre, holy mackerel, he has quite the background. So he is an entrepreneur. He is an accomplished speaker, an inventor, and an international business executive who brings over 15 years of expertise in the environmentally friendly transportation and logistics sectors. He currently works at Blue Duck Micromobility, where he is responsible for all the design, all the innovation, and the technical aspects of the fleet of electrical scooters and e-bikes. And he's also responsible for manufacturing and supply chain logistics, and is really focused on creating the most advanced commercial grade modular scooters and electric bicycles in the global market. But that's not all. He also has numerous patents. He's part of the Young Presidents Organization. He sits on the board of the, I think it's the Southeast LA American Red Cross. And he's just like over the top, entrepreneurship awards, etc. He had a business called Hollywood Trucks that he recently sold that serviced the entertainment industry. He's got a movie coming out that's being launched in, I think, Toronto. And so Andre is just a Renaissance guy, and he has some great negotiation stories and tips and tools that we're going to be able to talk about. So Andre, thank you so much for being here with me and with our audience. I really appreciate your taking time to do that.
It means a lot. It's an honor, and I don't need to even negotiate to hire a publicist.
Well, you wrote that very well.
I wrote it personally.
So tell us a little bit about how you kind of ended up into this journey. Tell us a little more about the journey that's taking you from where you grew up to kind of where you're at today.
Well, I was born and raised in Louisiana in a small town called Napoleonville, which is about 300 residents. And so I went to high school there, then graduated and attended Louisiana State University. And I was really fortunate to be raised by my grandfather, my grandmother, and my mom. And so who were all educators. So, I mean, watching television, interestingly enough, since I work in it now at times, was something that wasn't even on the desktop. We just read books all day. And so I was going into studying at LSU, was going to be the good family doctor, I guess you'd say, go down the noble noble route. And while I was going through it, it was something that I wasn't really passionate about. I did enjoy it. I ended up graduating, and I was going to go down the medical school route. And so that entire process was taking place. And at one point I just stopped. And I remember I drove home. I was doing volunteer hours at a local hospital. And I drove home and I just told my mom and my grandfather, and I just said, I cannot do this. And they said, okay, well, you probably want to think about that before, you go down this whole biochem route. And I said, I know, okay, in retrospect, we can go back to those things. But I said, I want to go to California, and I want to understand, you guys have always taught me intellectual property. And at that time, obviously books and stuff. So we didn't watch TV, we just read everything. And I said, I want to go and see. And the first time I was fascinated, because when I learned that a piece of IP, a script or a book or, anything, novel, article, became what you actually saw on television, I was just absolutely blown away, just fascinated by it. I didn't understand the process. I wanted to know more about it. And I said, okay, well, I bought a little car, and I knew no one in Los Angeles. So I drove to LA. I rented a little one-bedroom apartment at about $1,600. and I said, okay, well, I've got this, I've got to find a job first and foremost. I have to find a place to live. And so went through that whole process, like many people who venture out and take a risk and have no idea what they're going to do. I mean, I point blank drove to Los Angeles with no idea. I just knew it was going to be something in entertainment. And so what happened is I got a job as an intern at a studio and then began working through that process, got promoted, and then changed and was asked to head creative development at another film company. And so learning that, I was able to really grasp the ins and outs, I guess you call it in front of the camera, behind the camera, left of the camera, right of the table, every side from the business side, as well as the creative. And so during that process, I began to learn more and more about it. And what I was asked to do was come back to, I was in California now for about 4 years. And I was asked, Louisiana, the state had passed a tax credit program for film and television. And this was late 2007. And so I was asked to come back and look at a governmental role there and see if it was something that I was interested in bringing projects back to the state, producing them in the state, or any form of fashion. And flew back to Louisiana and started helping local government write the draft and become instrumental in the legislation. And it ended up passing, which is it's a great program, brought a substantial amount of economic development. And what happened was the state asked, well, okay, we've got this brand new program. Do you have any productions, or is there anyone you can bring to work through it? Mm-hmm. And so that is essentially how, and sounds quite interesting, but that's how the transportation company began. So, there was a film that was coming in. I was asked to help produce it. And while producing that film, there was no infrastructure at all in the state. So we had a fantastic tax credit program, but yet, sound stages, trucks, cameras, there was just no business or no infrastructure yet. So I was producing the film with a couple of friends, and we were looking for vans and trucks everywhere. We couldn't find them. And so went to a local business partner, asked if he could help us buy 5 vans. And what happened was we bought 5 vans and 2 trucks, and that essentially became Hollywood Trucks. Mm-hmm. And the name just came from the simple fact of that's what everyone called them in Louisiana, because they were the big white film trucks.
Right.
So I said, well, my thought was, let me just see if I can actually get that name. And long story short, that actually took 3 years and being rejected by the trademark office 4 times. But I was relentless. Finally got it. And so the company started. We had 5 vehicles, 5 trucks, a couple of vans, a couple of what they call stake beds. And they were rented for the entire year. And so I sat there with my business partner at the time and I said, this could actually be a pretty viable business. It's not exactly what I was interested in or thought about, but, well, this seems like it can be, profitable. And so we bought a couple of more trucks, we bought a couple of more, and the company really grew from what was supposed to be, I guess you'd call it a side job or a day job or mailbox money or whatever people, term it, into a full-time job. And so when we started it, it was only 2 of us and working 24/7. And we grew it to first year, we went from 5 vehicles to around 75. Mm-hmm. And then the next year, 150. We brought in new investors, 250, 350. And over the period of about 6-7 years, we grew from, 2 employees to 25, 30, multiple offices in the southeastern U.S. and then in London. Just the business grew cohesively with the program. Mm-hmm. But it was an unbelievable experience. It took my life path down a different area, and it led to where I am now. Which is still in the transportation sector after having sold Hollywood Trucks.
That is an incredible story. I love hearing those stories because over the course of that, you talked about a few things in there. So one of the things that you talked about was that this wasn't necessarily in your plan. This was not like you had this big grand life plan to go into the transportation industry
Not
and
at all. I had
support the
no
film
idea.
industry, right?
Yeah.
But I think, from a, like in negotiation, one of the hallmarks of really good negotiators is being able to be flexible to see opportunities when they present themselves. How has that skill set that you clearly developed as you were building Hollywood Trucks and actually decided to go into it, how has that skill set served you through the rest over the course of your career as you sold Hollywood Trucks and in the work you're doing now? And I'm very
I
curious about
think,
that.
I was always, I had great mentors along the way. So that was something that I really
Mm,
think is unbelievably important to give back. But I was always taught, opportunity exists where you seek it and find it. So it's everywhere. You can look at the glass, or as they say, the grass is greener on the other side. It's not. The grass is greener where you water it. So you just literally sit there and you look at what's in front of you, and I'm always thinking about solutions, always. And so, you can, obviously reality is what it is. And
mhm.
so one of the things that I found interesting about Hollywood Trucks is I had no business experience at all, zero, zilch. And I would go and sit, I would miss class all the time at LSU, and there was a Barnes and Noble, and I would go and sit at Barnes and Noble all day and just read any single book that I was fascinated by. And so some of those things, and I tried to start 2 or 3 little companies, even in college, that obviously failed miserably, didn't understand the structures, had no idea what I was doing, and so that led to reading books about corporate structures from LLCs and S Corps and C Corps and just things that were vastly different from the standard biochem. But I think what was really great was that, my mentors always said, formal education will earn you a living, self-education will earn you a fortune. So those
Mm,
are the things that I wanted to know everything. So if I, let's say wanted to start a business, I read so many books on the actual businesses themselves, and the tax structures. And this was before I even had one. And so that came in, and I think about it all the time because when Hollywood Trucks was formed, it wasn't even first and foremost, and I love to talk about all the ways that I failed and I didn't know, because these are the things that I wish a lot of the successful people or any of the mentors that we look at now would talk about, because it's the things that I related to where I was just, gosh, I have no idea how to form this structure. I have no idea,
mm,
wow, to pull out this, line of credit or anything. So when Hollywood Trucks was formed, I had a local investor come and ask that wanted to invest in the company.
mhm,
Absolutely had no idea how to value it. The company had only been open for 6 months, but maybe run $300,000 in revenue through it,
mhm.
maybe.
Yeah.
And he asked to buy 40% of it and asked for me to give him a price.
Mhm.
And I mean, Christine, I had no idea, no idea, So I came up with a formula that on the stock price that I asked him for, because I asked him for a pretty, material amount. I asked him for
Mhm.
1.5 million in cash, and a $10 million line of credit. Now, granted,
That's an impressive multiple.
I mean, the company
Yeah.
was 6 months old. We had 300K,
Yeah.
and that was for 40%. And when I presented it to him, and he's a wonderful guy, and I'm
Mhm.
great friends with him now.
Mhm.
And when I presented it to him, being a great guy like he is, he said, "Okay, can you give me how you derive? Can you give me the formulas or the thought process on how you derive this,
Mhm.
and let's discuss it." And so I did, and that's exactly what I got: 1.5 million and $10 million facility, because I walked him
Mm.
through the explanations. And the way we did it, which was at that time, I didn't even, I had no idea again, and I was just going, gosh, I hope this works. But we devised a formula at a
Mhm.
3-year period in which, that amount of equity that he had bought at that date
Yep.
could either, it was basically it could become a convertible note.
Sure.
Or equity, and it was derived by a formula that if the stock price was worth more than the 1.5, he paid cash. If it wasn't, it was a note, so
Yep.
it was, and interestingly enough, it worked out almost perfectly.
That's
I mean,
awesome.
I think it was 1.55. It came out to be worth it, and so that was something that, that was one of my first negotiations in business. And I was fortunate and lucky that it actually worked,
I'm curious.
So
So one of the things that I talk a lot when I do public speaking and I'm training and on negotiation, I talk a lot about how important it is to have clarity in what it is that we want out of the negotiation. And also then to take and say, once you know that and you've prioritized it for yourself, is it doable for your counterpart? Because if you ask something of your counterpart that's completely not doable and you have no logic behind it, then you're almost certain not to get it. So how did you, not having kind of the background, and I know we've got some venture capitalists who listen, and private equity people and finance people, and they're all whiz bangs at doing all this valuation stuff. But small businesses generally, this is like an area that's foreign to most small companies. And so how did you come up with the assumptions that you use to get in the formula? And the reason why I ask is because I often talk about how price is often, we often treat price as an output, that's like an outcome. But price is more often an output based on the assumptions that go into it, right? We, instead of negotiating price, negotiate the assumptions. So what I like about that story is that your counterpart, your partner, actually asked you, like, walk me through the math, help me understand the assumptions. So how did you come to those?
It was, I guess you'd say, a hybrid of some get structured EBITDA numbers versus potential sales, so it was a little bit of idle speculation, and combined with real business acumen. And so I consulted a couple of people on some of the actual business acumen side, the financial side.
Right.
And we were using tangible assets. So there was some mathematic and computational areas that I could base off of that, I knew any investor would understand and can relate to. And then there was the 50% side of just pure sales, pure, I'm going to do this, pure, you have to believe this, I give you my word, and here's the formula why. So if it doesn't work, this is what we owe you. So it was one of those things that, for us, it was also the film and television industry and transportation, respectively, had been around for, 50, 60 years. So there were, I wouldn't say there were comps, but there were at least metrics you could look at, and you could look at total production, and you could back into some of those. Plus, you had a really explosive market. At that time, Louisiana, had just passed a program, and supply and demand, we couldn't even come close to supplying for the demand. And so those were some of the, the key factors that took place there, that all of those together in concomitant fashion literally led to, okay, I'm with you. Let's do this. Let's give it a shot. Also, I think what's important to note is anytime you're looking for, let's say, strategic investment, look at those that can benefit vertically. So, my partner happened to be a car dealership expert and owned multiple dealerships. So, and that was one of the real great, incentivized areas for him, is because I tell you what, I'm going to buy the trucks from you, but I want fleet pricing. I want, service and maintenance contracts that are at fleet rates, all of these things. So it was another dual benefit. So for him, he was looking at it as, okay, well, I'm going to put 1.5 million cash into this business that I really have no idea if this is going to work or not. No one in the state really knew it. However, he's going to buy 80% of the vehicles from me. So that seems to work.
Right.
And so I think that those, as even now, anytime that I talk to anyone looking at a company or looking at investment, is look for those individuals first and foremost, that there is some form of substantial dual benefit to them as well, and it will at least facilitate the conversation being easier, or give a greater, I guess you'd say, a greater node to the investment potentially happening, because they're going to see,
That's excellent. And I agree 100% with that, because whenever you're sitting down for a negotiation, and before I continue, I want to go back, because I know we have a lot of finance people who listen, but also for those of you who don't know what EBITDA is, it's earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. So I just want to make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of the acronym. But one of the things that I love, this is such a great story on so many levels. And one of the things I really like about it is that you're highlighting just critical teaching points along the way. And one of them is about how you look at a counterpart, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we do, we've created kind of a quiz for people to take to learn their default negotiation style. And if somebody wants to text then to 26786, they can kind of figure that out. They can take the quiz and figure it out. But there are two styles of negotiation styles. One's a champion and one's a maverick, and they tend to be very focused on the win right now for them. And the challenge for those two styles is that they don't often and don't naturally look to say, what does this if I get this, what does it mean for my counterpart? How can I position my ask in a way that is mutually beneficial to my counterpart? So I really love what you just shared, because it highlights the importance of understanding what that mutual benefit is. I mean, let's be honest, right? 6 months of business, yeah, right. So you generated 300 grand in revenue in 6 months. That could have just been a fluke, right? Now it's a benefit that you had been part of developing the legislation that got passed. So you were intimately familiar with certain aspects of the conversation across, across at least the state government. Being able to leverage that and figuring out, I mean, that's not many people would be confident enough in where they were at after 6 months and 300 grand in revenue to go ask somebody for $1.5 million in cash investment and $10 million, line of credit, right? Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the negotiation that you had to have with yourself to get yourself to the point where you were willing to ask for that, because that's the hardest part of any negotiation, is the negotiation we have between our ears. And so to have that ask says a lot about what you believed about what you were asking in and of itself internally.
I mean, you have to believe it. You have to. It has to begin right there. If you do not believe it and you're not at the mindset of I'm willing to risk everything for this, it's not the right business. And so that's the way I've always viewed it. And so once I really took and subscribed to, okay, I can do this. I'm learning these vehicles. I saw so many opportunities with it, Christine. It was unbelievable, because again, it was an archaic business. So I was looking very far down the line of, okay, once I get this capital and get going, this is where I'm going to expand to. There's not a single franchise model in film transportation ever in history. There's no environmentally friendly. I mean, I was so excited that if I had to say there was one Achilles heel through the process is, I was always taught protect your enthusiasm. But at times I would get so excited and so above it that, I was like, okay, I got to take a beat back and combine the mathematical parts with it, with the excitement, and that'll work. but you just have to believe in what you're going out and asking for. So again, when I came up with that formula, you know, it wasn't, I had really no idea whether it was going to be fantastic or be terrible. And I
Mm-hmm.
think anyone going into starting their own company, you have to think about two things, like we're talking about with the vertical integration of your
Mm-hmm.
partner. Number one, if it's a small business, the person investing into the business, they're going to be really close to you. I mean, like they're in a part, it's almost like they're coming into your family. So
Mm-hmm.
you really want to create substantial value for them. So even let's say hypothetically in a worst case scenario, you know, they've invested into your company, and because it's vertically aligned and you know, in that instance, I had bought 75 vehicles from this
Mm-hmm.
one dealership in one calendar year. And after they invested into my company,
Mm-hmm.
well, that year wasn't a great year for their dealership, and that investment totally changed it and turned it around for them. So whether we were,
Mm-hmm.
and they were, you know, in the first, obviously the first 2 and 3 years of a business is very hard to
Right.
earn net profit. And so even though they had invested into my company, and at that time we were still growing, still at the embryonic stages, we had no
Mm-hmm.
idea where it would eventually go. You know, it helped their dealership. And so I think the relationship that you have with your investor is very important, especially the smaller entity, whether it's, you know, a small, closely held LLC, or
Mm-hmm.
whether, you know, your end goal is to IPO. You have to always think about who is coming into your company, what's your relationship with them,
Mm-hmm.
and you always want to keep it the best possible. You know,
Right.
so generate as much happiness for them as possible, and different facets, and ultimately they'll continue to reinvest. And so
Oh,
those are things that I
oh, go
know.
ahead. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's
Yeah. That people don't, you just hit on something that I want to kind of move to, because I think that a lot of small businesses, when people start their companies, right, they get so excited about their company and they fall in love with their idea, which can kind of create its own issues, but they don't plan an exit. And it's unlikely that most people are going to, run their business till they die, or want to run their business till they die. They want it. There's going to come some point in time when life is going to change for them, and they're going to want to have a different relationship with the business, or no relationship at all. At what point did you start to develop your exit strategy? And then how did what you envisioned as your exit strategy, how did that unfold when you actually did exit Hollywood Trucks?
well. To be quite frank, when we decided to sell the company, it wasn't on the plan for the year. You know, it
Mm,
wasn't on the agenda yet.
hmm
We were still growing, and what happened was, you know, we were being asked, because we had developed some products and the offerings that were now patented and really in the vanguard of an entire movement of clean tech, you know, like an
hmm
electric car. So
Right.
again, the trailers, the Ecolux trailers that we developed were the first of their kind. It's essentially an off-grid RV.
hmm
Um, and what happened was there was a real big warrant for those products and outside of film and television.
hmm
And so we were looking at also inside of film and television as well. And so we were deciding, okay, well, in order for us to go to the next phase of growth, it's going to require at least a strong 8-figure investment, or even up
mm
to 9 figures, you know, to scale into what we saw as, again, a global company
Right.
or something of significant value. And during that process, a couple of the companies that were actually looking at the investment looked at it in a different perspective and said, well, we would like to actually discuss an acquisition. And
hmm
that's how that came about. So it
Okay.
actually wasn't on the agenda.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so I really want, you know, anyone listening to understand as well, there's going to be things that come out of left field
Yeah.
that you're not prepared for. or you thought was going to be something 2 or 3 years or 5 or 10 down the line. And you're going to have to weigh, the pluses and minuses. And also what I always begin with is, how do you create value for your investors? That's primary focus. Also, many people don't even look at, payback schedules or anything. My goal and focus is, quite frankly, get them paid off as soon as possible. And they're just going to be really happy. And,
Yeah.
And so that's always something that I've looked at, and wanted to create value for them. But this came completely out of left field. I mean, ultimately, we had an exit plan, down the line, and we had tapped into something that was really taking the company on a pivot. And so from, I wouldn't say away from film and television, but into many other real new fascinating silos of business, which dealt with all the way from disaster relief. I mean, think about it. When you have a mobile asset that you can place anywhere in the world and it runs with full HVAC, film, television, any of your amenities that you want for extensive and unknown periods of time, there's multiple silos of business you can now begin to look at from, like I said, we were looking at private sector, defense contracts, standard RVs, just the standard RV market. Film and television just happened to be one, that we were involved in at the time. But so it was really taking the company into a whole different perspective. And that led to the differentiation of what we decided to sell and retain.
Right. So tell us a little bit about that, because you sold part of it, but you did retain some aspects of the business.
That's correct. So we sold all of the film and television assets. So the actual tangible trucks and trailers, to another company that was involved in the film and television business. So it was a benefit for them as well. They could gain two notable areas. We were by far a major competitor for them. So if they could take some of that out of it. And they could also utilize the assets immediately, because we were a recognizable brand and they were readily available. A lot of these are specialized units, so it takes time to build them. They didn't have to go through any of the weight factors. So those were two benefits for them. The benefits for us was, okay, well, we'll sell the tangible assets, but we'll retain all the intellectual property. So the actual entity itself, the LLC, any of the, we had a holding company that held the different entities in different states along with the intellectual property. So we maintained ownership of all of those and the IP, the patents, the trademarks, copyrights, all of those, and just sold the tangible asset.
So then tell me how, so now you're doing this new thing. So all the stuff that you developed, the patents you developed and that you hold and all that, now has kind of parlayed you into this new area around e-bikes and scooters and all that. So tell me about how are some of the things that you did and learned from a negotiation perspective over the course of Hollywood Trucks. How is that translating into the work that you're doing now?
Unbelievably well, and an absolutely important factor. The new area of focus when I was growing Hollywood Trucks, I became really involved in clean tech and really wanted to, I'd taken trips across the world and saw, how important it is for us to be environmentally conscious, and even moreover my own company and how I could differentiate that from others. So, those patents took 7 years of my life to develop. We probably spent, $4.5 million just on R&D, building trailers that didn't work, but still had to actually work. I mean, the amount of knowledge that I went through in that period was the greatest, I guess you'd say, accomplishment of my own intellect in that time period. Just there's so many different factors came into building those units. And like you talked about, from manufacturing, clean tech, all the way, every single part. I wrote half of the formulas, I was intimately involved in every part. So what happened was during that process, you essentially become an expert in clean tech transportation. And so the assets are even though they're in different classifications, they're all going towards the same goal of being a clean manner of moving someone from point A to point B. During that, when I was building those units, I was always fascinated. I mean, I live in Venice, California, Los Angeles. So, when the birth of the micromobility industry began, let's say late 2016, early 2017, the first couple of scooters were placed right around my house. And at that time, I thought, that's really smart. That's a really interesting business model. It's a rental, it's a rental fleet. And that's what I was just coming out of. And it's purported as a clean tech rental fleet. So I was monitoring it even during the, Hollywood Trucks was sold 2019. I was monitoring it in 17, 18, and 19, and really looking at how can I bring these, essentially what we call e-bikes and scooters, how can I even start bringing them into my own fleet and my own company? And began to study those units more and more just over the 2 years, and got to the point where once the company was sold in 2019, I was at a point where I was so ready to go on that part of my next career. Because again, I saw, wow, this is an explosive industry. I mean, growing as fast. I think Bird, one of the major players right now, was the first one to unicorn in history. And so I have to get involved in this. I have to become a part of this, and I know this like the back of my hand. So including the assets and the bikes, and I can see where, they're getting some of these areas right. And I can see where they're really missing some of the major opportunities. And so the moment Hollywood Trucks closed, I think on a Friday. And by that time I had already not only in my mind solidified the fact that that's the industry I was going to go into, I was already looking at different companies that I would want to work with, and bring the knowledge and input that I had into their hardware development, specifically at a very specific focus. I mean, at the core of those businesses, they are rental businesses, they're fleets, and you've got a point of sale, so however, the hardware side was something that I really saw, wow, they're putting these scooters and bikes into the public sector for everyone to use, yet these are coming essentially off the shelf. And so the useful life of them is, what we found historically is it was only about 30 days.
That's incredible.
Buy a scooter and I can go into the depths of those business models and where I see great attributes and where I see, substantial areas for improvement. But that's so all of the I guess you'd say the knowledge, the life lessons, the negotiation, tactics, skills, understandings. I certainly also learned, okay, well, if I'm actually going to start a company in micromobility, or even if I'm going to join one, I certainly understand the structures better now. To not only, let's say, negotiate my own deal, but also just to be able to bring value to whatever company I joined in the growth stage. So whether it's a seed round, a Series A, B, C, whatever it might be. I knew that, okay, now having a really great, sophisticated understanding of it over the years from trials and tribulations. Yeah, a lot of it, reading books and learning from very sophisticated investors and, let's say corporate financial structures. But it just came to the point where, okay, I now amassed a knowledge that was functional, working, and I know I could bring value to the company across multiple platforms. And so that's how we got to, micromobility.
Got it. So what do you see as some of the biggest negotiation challenges in that industry as we move forward? I mean, I live in downtown Los Angeles, and right, pre-pandemic, not so much an issue now, but Man, people bring the scooters into the buildings and just kind of park them there, or, they're all over the streets and people are tripping over them. I saw one run over a dog once, and just it's because they were on the sidewalk. And so it's an interesting model. It's definitely got some bumps that it's trying to work out, I think. But what, from a negotiation perspective, what are some of the big challenges you see for the model taking off on a global level? Because I know that's something that's of interest to you, is the globalization of that market. So what are some of those?
The first biggest negotiation you're going to have is with the city.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say when the business began, there were different tactics and growth, like I should say, factors that were being used, where you woke up overnight and someone had dropped 1,000 scooters into the city, know? And so, we take a different approach than that. It begins, you have to work with the municipality. So, where we focus, what I understood was that, okay, these are your partners, no different than your investors. They're investing into the success of your business. They can directly impact that based upon what legislation they write. So you absolutely want to work cohesively with them. And even in many of the cities that we work in, we write the actual code and policies with them or for them, and let them have some of the red lines. And so that was something that we saw was unbelievably important, because they are your partner, and that way you don't have, let's say, drop a bunch of units into commerce and then the city comes back and bans them. They've literally just taken the market away. So I think one of the first most important parts of negotiation is where the geographic region. Where are you deploying the assets? And this is a global perspective. So some cities right now to date have a ban. Some have a fantastic policy with operators there. Some are considering it. Some have no policy at all. And so it's been, because the business is growing so quickly, it's very congruent to when Uber and Lyft and the rideshare companies began their stratospheric growth. Just, I don't even know if that's a word.
Even if it isn't, it is today.
I just made it. So,
that's fine.
But it's very similar to that, in the fact of the growth and the interactions with the city. But it's vastly different, because you have essentially a rental business. You're putting assets into the municipality for the private sector to use. And so that's a different point of sale process. And that's a negotiation within itself too.
Absolutely.
So, anytime you're going to grab one of these units, you're negotiating with yourself on which one you're going to take. But I think that the primary, from the corporate side, the primary negotiation is first and foremost with the city. And then secondly, it always comes back to capital and how fast can you scale the business? What's the metrics and models behind that? As you've seen, because it's very, the one thing about our business, micromobility, it's global and it's very vocal. Because it impacts so many cities. So you see a lot of companies raising significant amounts of capital, and, from all of your major players, all your Sequoias, Blackstones, and all, the myriad of the, your powerful players in venture capital or private equity. So you see large raises occurring. So the companies are painting the picture of, okay, this is our anticipated revenues, here's our anticipated growth, here's our anticipated EBITDA, here's all of those factors. So every part of it, the negotiation begins again. And we're no different than that. So we're raising capital. You're primarily in a capital raise stance, pretty much through the growth pattern, as long as you're growing at a rapid scale. So every single intellectual asset that I learned through Hollywood Trucks is now I bring that to, micromobility, and every one of them is being used.
That's incredible. Congratulations, because that's a huge accomplishment. You were for going down a path that you'd never thought in your wildest imagination that you would be on, and the things that you've done to kind of move an industry forward, and really to move an industry forward into clean tech and in the transportation. I know when we talked a few days ago, we were kind of chuckling that Hollywood's so says they're so eco-friendly, and so many of the superstars are like all about the environment, but this was an area of the Hollywood machine that was absolutely not eco-friendly.
Not being touched.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, the highest, one of the, highest carbon footprints of it. So, and that was one of the reasons that I knew, okay, if we're going to make a substantial difference, from an environmental perspective, the vehicles are primary. I mean, really primary.
Yeah.
And no one was addressing it, in film and television in that sector.
So how can people find you?
No, okay, how can you find anything?
Because I'm sure, I mean, this is just such an interesting topic, and it's, with Tesla going public this week, right? So that's like, wow. His and all of Elon's work with SpaceX and everything, but with Tesla went public this week, and I think he added like $500 million to his net worth. I think it was impressive.
Actually, they've been public, but I think their stock price is going through the roof, and I think he probably added like 500 billion.
Yeah. No, there was something that they did this week, and I can't remember. So we might strike that part.
They've had a recent stock split, but they were, taking
maybe that was what it was.
The S&P. It's probably
it was the S&P. That's what that's what it was. So, but I mean, this is such a huge area of concern and interest, and it's going to be interesting. And I don't usually bring politics into the episode, but it is going to be interesting given the change in administrations that appears to be imminent. What the Biden administration is going to do that's going to be beneficial to your industry that may not have been the case under a continued Trump administration. Yeah. So I'll be really curious to pay attention, and I'm sure our listeners many of our listeners are going to be fascinated to kind of follow you and follow the work that you're doing in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time, and I mean, again, it's unbelievable. I'm so thankful to see, the things that Elon's doing, and, and what's really coming from a perspective of, let's say, clean tech or environmental, best practices. I mean, take something like, for me, it's like a kid in a candy store. I mean, I sit here and I show my son, some of the Falcons actually reversing and landing back at Portal. And he just doesn't even believe me, which is really unbelievable, at times, because he's 10 years old and he just doesn't think that it's fact. So Elon allows, people like myself to really push our own boundaries, because pushing them on such a different level. And I applaud everything that Tesla has done, and any of the clean tech companies really pushing that movement forward, because it's inevitable. It's not even a question anymore. And it would be really unbelievable to see, Nikola Tesla, the C, with all the 145 amazing patents, that he wrote that are being really, marketed and branded now. I mean, from, AC power and DC power, and, the telephone and just all of the, radio frequency, and I mean, the internet and all of the things that he wrote. And it would be amazing for me to see what he would think about now if he were here, and the fact that finally these global changes are occurring and moving to electrification, and so that I would be fascinated by that. But
what a brilliant man. I went to because he's from Serbia, and I went to his I think it was his childhood home in Belgrade, and wow, what an incredible human being in terms, so smart, so crazy,
the intellectual property, and I mean now even from that. So, and looking
how many
at
napkins did he throw away with great ideas on them? Right?
But one of the things when you're talking about negotiation, one of the things about Tesla that he really didn't focus on was negotiation of his own IP. And
absolutely.
And it goes back to his interactions with J.P. Morgan and all of the individual backers, and how he utilized the capital that he had. He really wasn't someone driven by net profit or the monetization of his IP. And so I think when you're talking about negotiation, I think there was one contractual, and don't quote me, but I think where it was the one based upon, I think, 1 kilowatt of power versus 1 horsepower that he had, that would today, and he tore it up. He literally tore it up, and I think it would be worth around $17 trillion today.
Holy mackerel! I know. I gotta go find that and research that, because that's a great story. I mean, I think the thing is, so I've worked in the technology industry for pretty much my entire career. I've been involved in telecommunications, hardware, software development, all of that kind of stuff. And a lot of the contracts that I've negotiated are tech-related contracts. And so one of the reasons why I launched Venn Negotiation is because I had worked with so many of the big Fortune, 100, 500 tech companies. And I'd see them, they're like pythons, right? They'd take the small, innovative companies, the tech companies, and just squeeze the life out of them. And then they'd eat them. Because a lot of really brilliant, amazing people in technology, they're not negotiators, and they can sometimes get very emotional about the product that they've developed, because it takes so much intellectual horsepower and so much perseverance and resilience. And like you're just even your trademark for the name of the company, right? 4 times, right? And it's like you have to go back and back again and back again, and then you might have somebody who's trying to steal stuff. I mean, it's just there's all this stuff, and so in that process, so often I see smaller tech companies just getting so wrapped up emotionally into their idea that when it comes time to negotiate, they either hold on too tight, or and they lose the opportunity because they're not willing to give enough, or they give it all away and they get nothing in return, and they don't get to take their product over the finish line and reap the benefit of all that work that they did. And so that's one of the reasons why I started Venn Negotiation, is to help companies like that, so that they had a better chance.
And that within itself is a negotiation to, actually have someone. You can't do it all by yourself. I mean, those were some of my, again, growth areas through Hollywood Trucks, is that, it takes a team, and if you're the smartest person in the room, something's not right.
You're in the wrong room. You better find a different room.
So find the smartest people and bring them, bring them with you, and work with them. But and negotiation is it's life. Every single thing you do in life, you're negotiating. Whether you're negotiating with yourself, or if you're sitting there at lunch or dinner with your friend, or whatever it is, your child, it doesn't matter. So, it takes some time. And I've read, as which we talked about.
I'm going to ask you to tell me which of those 3 books is your favorite so far, but keep going.
But after I'll tell you. very, very frankly, but I think it's important to also know that it's, you've gotta be free enough to rely on other people's expertise and let them do what, and that's how I've always loved to run my own companies is,
Mhm.
really let people flourish and see, you can always bring something back if if
Right.
you don't want the
Right.
idea of the concept. But if you're cutting it off before they've even had a chance to, you know, potentially bring you an idea or thought that could be the single most valuable thought that it's okay if it's not your thought. That's fine. you
Right.
know,
Exactly.
I mean, don't,
Exactly.
don't get married to it.
So we started down the road of how people can find you, but how can people find you?
Well, I mean, it's easy on LinkedIn. I mean, I think my personal emails are there, so anyone can shoot
Awesome.
me an email anytime. Really, I get emails all day, every day, obviously, like everyone does. So,
Hmm.
and I read all day. So,
Yes.
um, I think that's it. Really, really easy to get a hold of.
Awesome. Well,
In
thank you.
this in this day and age, you can find
Yeah, I
anyone.
can pretty much find
Yeah.
anybody. So when Andre and I were first talking, when we talked a few days ago, he was reading, he's reading, starting to read 3 books, or I don't know if you started them or getting ready. I couldn't remember the first one, but I think it had something to do with marketing. The second one was Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference, which we've
Right.
talked about on the show before. And
Yeah.
then the third one was about human cosmic psychology, or something like that. And that
Yeah.
one was very fascinating to me.
Cosmic
And I,
consciousness.
I was like, I had such a great conversation with you all throughout that. But I have to tell you, I've talked a lot about those 3 books because
Well,
I love to read as well.
yeah.
I'm an avid reader. And so I am always interested in, what is your favorite book so far of 2020?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I never pick. I mean, I'm going to be frank and say I never pick favorites. I pick
Mm,
small anecdotes from each one that I bring
I
into
like
my life, and then that goes into my little toolbox.
it.
And so, anytime, let's say, I encounter an environment where that becomes realistic or realism, then I've got to put a knowledge point from there.
Mm,
So I try not to pick favorites. I mean, I try to just take each one for what they are.
mhm.
Um, and then that way, when you're sitting talking because again, life is about negotiations, it's about human interaction. And
Right.
so you and I may have a reference point. Christine, you say, "Oh, I was sitting here, I was sitting at lunch and I was reading about this particular kale, and I may have, read a book about it, and I'm, oh, well, yeah, that's the actual C12 strand that they grow, and in fact,
I could
and
see
then
us having that conversation.
yeah, and then we have, a great, and then you're just like, wow, this, hey, this guy's enjoyable. I'm enjoying. So, the human interaction part of the negotiation between you and I is going to be much more favorable, because
Absolutely.
we're getting along.
Oh yeah. I mean,
you know?
negotiations a series of yeses. You start with building small yeses,
Yeah.
and they're cumulative, right? The more
Hey,
yeses you
book
build,
about,
you get in a relationship,
how
the
to win
easier it
friends and
is.
influence people.
Yeah, exactly. The
That one's
easier
been
it is to
around
deal
for a
with the
while.
conflict. Oh, it's such a good book, though.
Yeah, you may
It's
want to pick that one up. That one's been
yeah,
around for a while.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
But but yeah, I just try to take a small amount from each one, because you generally, anytime you read a book, you might retain 5 to 10% of it.
Oh, absolutely.
If it's so, the ones that I reread and are those will have a more significant impact on me. But obviously, I try to take something away from each one and a bit of understanding, and that's pretty much how I've done it all my life.
I love that. I love that. So I'm going to reword my question for my next guest.
Well, and again, some people do have favorites. That's, I mean, like
Oh,
everybody.
yes, absolutely. But I like how I usually have like a top 3 or 5 list in a year
Yeah.
that I've gotten the most out of, that where there's like multiple things that I've gotten out of it that has helped me grow as a person. And sometimes they're unusual and people have like, I've never heard of that. And I'm like, but it's, so.
Yeah, my question back on that kind of dictates my thought process is, okay, if you have 5 books that you read that year, do those permeate your thought process of that year, and do you ever look back and say, okay, I read these 5 books in 2016 and this is what happened, or this is what I accomplished. I read these books in 2017 and this is what do you ever like look back on those and think that those have
So I average about a book a week.
Okay.
And so I've never made a correlation between kind of the performance of a year versus the book that I've read. Last year's books, and I had read the ones that I had got the most out of, I read all of them toward the end of the year instead of at the beginning, which was really surprising. And so one was a philosophy book, one was like a sociology book, and then the other one was Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers, but which is a phenomenal book. But I take a little bit out of all the books I read too, but just generally every year there's 3 to 5 that just really kind of bubble up as these books are something that I'll talk about for a long time.
Yeah, and they have a material impact on your life.
Yeah, exactly. But I haven't done that correlation. That would actually be kind of interesting.
Yeah, or just kind of you can look and say, okay, these 5 books in 2015, really had such a dramatic impact on me, and that's why I went to India in 2016. Or
a year
in India. I'm always fascinated by how the influences around you, whether they're books, people, movies, music.
These are things that matter in negotiation. These things that have influence on us, right? They give us the opportunity to build relationship as we move forward, just like your kale example. So they give us that opportunity to find common ground when we may think we don't have any. Right. And, being curious enough, as one of my mentors, Blair Dunkley, talks about, being curious enough to discover that and to ask questions in a way that leads you down that road of discovery goes a long way in helping you be successful in your negotiation and in business and in your personal life and just life in general. So,
and it's wonderful that you said curiosity, because I think that's probably been one of the bigger factors in what I've done so far in life. I don't even like to use the word success because it's relative, but just in human interaction. I always do it in human interaction, and I genuinely enjoy people. So I could ask question after question after question after question.
Right.
Like that. Let's say not on the podcast that I'm fascinated by, even after the recordings are done and everything, and just that I just genuinely want to know.
Right. Yes.
And I found it that it's been a great attribute, because most people like to hear themselves speak all the time, and that's fine. But you really when you listen, that's when you're really, I think, gaining the most intelligence. Or that's when you're having the greatest form of human interaction.
I could not agree more. We're going to close out in here in a minute, but the humanity aspect, the human aspect, humanity is the thing that gives me the most hope in the world, is humanity. That somebody asked me, like, what gives you hope? And the first thing I didn't even think about it, is like humanity. I just have the utmost faith and hope as a result of humanity. But it's that human connection. So we're going to close on kind of this quote that actually one of my daughters they're all in their 30s. So when I say my daughters, I'm not talking about little kids. So one of my daughters works with me, and she actually just helped me come up with a new way of, she was listening to me talk about how I feel about negotiation and this human aspect of negotiation. And we were talking about it in terms of kind of something we talked about earlier, how so many people negotiate in the moment to win. And negotiation is nothing more than a conversation about a relationship.
Yes.
And there is no win in a relationship. You cannot win in a relationship.
I cannot even tell you how much I agree with that. I cannot even tell you how much I agree with that. And anytime I've ever had to, been fortunate to speak to students or, young entrepreneurs or any of it, that part is unbelievably important. And I never once, and I can say without a doubt, never once sat at a negotiation with the mindset of the word winning for today.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been, how do we benefit? How does this relationship become enhanced? I never used the word winning in it because I felt because it means the other person, someone has to lose.
Right, exactly.
And if they walk away from the table feeling like they lost, then that's not a great relationship, especially if this person's going to be with me involved in this business or any of the things we're doing. So I always walked away saying, how do we enhance in my mindset? How do I create value and enhance this relationship where, hey, we're 5 years from now, we're both, parking the yachts and having boat drinks. So
right. Exactly.
It's not material driven, but it's like, how do we enhance that? And that's how I've always gone into it. And that's why I always felt like both people have to walk away from the table feeling like they've won something or they've got something. And if you're looking at a long-term relationship with someone, you definitely don't want to walk away from the table, with the mindset that, oh, I just crushed this negotiation, because you can bet that on the other side of the table, once that works out and becomes reality, and yes, even if you did negotiate an unbelievable deal, there's going to be some form of remorse on the other side.
Absolutely.
And that usually leads to, not a great working relationship long-term for the company. So I always find, how do I create significant value for both of us?
Exactly.
And that's how I go into the thought process of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is one of the reasons, Andre, why I'm so glad to have you on the show, because a lot of the things that you talk about are things that I talk about when I'm teaching people, when I'm consulting with clients to help them move forward so that they're getting more of what they want, but they're also identifying and creating more, if that makes sense, right? It's like there's the way that you and I both talk about negotiation requires a change in how we think about negotiation, because most people approach the negotiation table as this win-loss thing, which means that they're negotiating from a position of scarcity versus negotiating from a position of abundance, that there is more than enough for all of us to participate in. So how do we figure that part out? And that's what I'm just so passionate about. That's my tagline for Venn negotiation. Our tagline is changing the nature of negotiation, because we really want that mentality, that those people to act based on abundance, that there's more than enough for all of us. And I mean, certainly there's situations where that isn't the case, right? There are definitely negotiations that happen where it's not all about growing and improving. Divorce comes to mind, business bankruptcy comes to mind. I mean, you definitely have those situations, but even in those situations, there are ways for people to get more and to get more out of those relationships and situations as well.
So global compound interest. It's the ninth wonder of the world.
So Andre, it has been a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. I feel like I could talk to you for a lot longer. It has been great. And to all our listeners, thank you for staying tuned in. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of In the Venn Zone. And until then, have a great day. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Venn Zone with Christine McKay. We invite you to visit our website at www.venn.zone to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Empower the negotiator in you and successfully level the playing field. Join us again next time here on In the Ven Zone.